celebrating another milestone of Mapandan National High School as it sends its third batch of graduates of senior high school. Learners have patiently waited for this day to come as they finally reap the fruit of their labor. Continuously, Mapandan National High School brings its best of quality education that every learner deserves. A quality education that is offered and catered to every track. For academic track, accountancy, business and management, humanities and social sciences, general academic strand, and science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. For TVL track, where skills are properly important, which is evident as learners under this track are now national certificate holders, caregiving, cookery, and computer system servicing. Mark this day as Mapandan National High School presents the first ever virtual commencement exercises with the theme Sulong Ito Kalidad, Championing the Nation's Future.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Toyang magiliw, pera sa silanganan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib ay buhay. Lumang hinirang, tuyang ka ng pag-ibig, sa manlulumig, di ka masisingin, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mo bukaw, may dinatang tula at awit sa paglayang minamahal. Ang pistak ng wataan mo'y tanong ay narating, ang bituin na parang lakay at kamay di magtitingin. Lumanang araw ng walang ibang sila, buhay ay langit sa piling mo. Ang hindi kaya ng pagkay ng langit, namamatay lang dahil sa'yo.
Today, in the world where life is born, there's a struggle that always fought to be welcomed, to be cared for, to be at home. Today, when our life seems bought and used, there's a struggle to belong, to be free and to be a gift to everyone. We call our families, rise up and raise your hands as one. Come show the world the love that bonds all God's children into one. We call our families, share the treasure that's in your hands. What can save us now? What can lead us now? What can make us all be one? Only selfless love. Jesus showed the world that only selfless love can bring 100-fold. Our fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, homes, where peace and mercy reign, where faith and hope remain, where life begins and ends in God's embrace. Calling all families, let's make it happen through only selfless love. Like the Holy Family with Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, home is where true love begins. Love rejoices, love embraces. We call all families, rise up and raise your hands as one. Come show the world the love that binds all God's children into one. We call all families, share the treasure that's in your hands. What can save us now? What can lead us now? What can make us all be one? Only selfless love. Jesus showed the world that only selfless love can bring 100-fold. Our fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, homes, where peace and mercy reign, where faith and hope remain, where life begins and ends in God's embrace. Calling all families, let's make it happen. Calling all families, let's make it happen through only selfless
Berkatan dayungi Pangasinan binabli Deun mo tani yaligwas Diuragep ko lawas Dan puso Pangasinan Agkanalingwanan Luyak ko yaniyanagan Bedetakan yaman Mantuan nalikwas mula kaya bigay buhay, gagabay sa aming paglalakbay. Bigis ng pagkakaisang tunay, tungo sa aming tagumpay. Alay sa iyo, buhay at tangal, kadakilaan mo ang laging dasal. Kailanman at saan man kami magawin, ngalan mo'y taas noong ibang tubuli. Mapandan bayan naming minumutya, Mapandan bayan naming minumutya, Mapandan.
Makes us all proud to be one. Make the differences our stand. Empower our dearest land. In our heart is a delight to make our children's future bright. Together for the dreams we fight, as each goal's made to God so tight. It's still one. Still one, you are the one. Anchor of every child's journey, maker of bright destiny. Embrace culture and dignity, work with goodwill and harmony. Honesty and sincerity, serve with pride and unity. One Pangasinan, public service at its finest, right there to bring out the best and stand out among the rest. Share kindness for the nature that our children will treasure, where they live a brighter future and make our dreams a nurture. Still one Pangasinan, it's still one, you are the one. Anchor of every child's journey, maker of bright destiny. Embrace culture and dignity, work with goodwill and harmony. Honesty and sincerity, serve with pride and unity. There's still one Pangasinan, there's still one, you are the one. Anchor of every child's journey, maker of bright destiny. Embrace culture and dignity, work with goodwill and harmony. Honesty and sincerity, serve with pride and unity.
Office of the DepEd Secretary Office Message, Secretary Lenore Magsolis Briones. Office of the Regional Director Message, Director Tolentino Giacchino. Office of Schools Division Superintendent Message, SDU1 Pangasinan, Dr. Sheila Marie A. Promasias.
Isang mainit na pagbati sa mga pinakatatanging graduates at completers sa school year 2019-2020. Ako ay lubos na natutuwa at nagagalag na matagumpay ninyong narating ang puntong ito ng inyong pagkatuto. Ako ay higit na natutuwa kasama ng inyong mga magulang, mga guro at ang buong komunidad na inyong kinabibilangan sa mapagwaging pagsalubong sa bagong bukas na may kalakip na hamong mas pagbutihin pa ang pagsulong at pagsuong sa buhay. Sa tema sa taong ito, sulong edukalidad, pagtataguyod sa kinabukasan ng bayan. Tayo ay sabay nahahayo at susulong upang maisakatuparan ang pangarap ng bawat isa na maitaguyod ang magandang bukas at makamit ang layunin para sa sarili, para sa komunidad at para sa bayan. Sa panahong ito na tayo ay nahaharap sa malawakang pandemiko na nagbigay takot at bumalot sa mundo ng sakit, huwag nating kalimutang maging positibo, produktibo at proaktibo upang maipagpatuloy ang ating magandang nasimulan sa ating paaralan. Maging resourceful din tayo sa patuloy na paglago ng ating kaalaman. Gamit ang napakaraming pamamaraang maaari nating magamit. Sa ating mga completers at graduates, magkaroon tayo ng matibay na sandigan at paniniwala na magkakaroon tayo ng mas maayos, mas malusog, at mas matibay na bukas na naghihintay sa atin, hindi man tayo sigurado sa kung ano ang hatid ng bukas sa atin. Maging mas matibay sana ang paniniwala natin sa mas maliwanag na bukas. Tulad nga ng winika ng ating mahal na Pangulo Rodrigo Duterte, mahirap ang ating kakaharapin at tatahakin. Pero magtulungan at magkaisa tayong muli. Kasama ang bawat isa, magkapit-bisig at magkapit-balikan, nating tahakin ang daan tungo sa magandang kinabukasan ng ating mahal na bayan. 10 ng buong pampaaralang tanggapan ng Sangay 1 ng Pangasinan, patuloy nating suportahan ang sulong edukalidad. Ipagpatuloy natin ang kultura ng karangalan, kagalingan at kahusayan. Patuloy na ikalat ang mga buto ng dekalidad na edukasyon. Mabuhay ang batch 2020.
Office of the Municipal Mayor Message, Honorable Anthony C. Pinollar. Office of the Public Schools District Superintendent, Dr. Nicanor L. Langit. President Message, Ma'am Helen M. Corla. Office of the Principal Message, Ma'am Elvira O. Velasquez, Principal 4. To inspire our graduates, we shall now hear important message from our distinguished guest who graduated from Mapandan Central School as second honorable mention and took a Bachelor of Arts and Social Sciences, major in Economics, minor in Political Science at University of the Philippines. Now she taking up Juris Doctor, Bachelor of Law at University of Pangasinan, FINMA. And the best way to boast the institution's pride of how it has molded its students is no other than hearing it from the direct product of this learning institution who graduated as valedictorian are now our guest of honor and speaker, no other than the first ever future lawyer of Mapandan National High School, Ma'am Eliza Lalas.
Let me take this remarkable opportunity to thank our dignitaries, Deputy Secretary Leonor M. Briones, Deputy Regional Director Tolentino Aquino, SDO1 Pangasinan Assistant School Division Superintendent Dr. Sheila Marie Premesias, Mr. Nicanor Langit, our PSDS Mapandan District, Honorable Anthony Pinolyar, Mapandan Municipal Mayor, PTA President Ms. Helen M. Corta, and our beloved Principal 4 of Mapandan-Shs, Madam Elvira Velasquez, and to all teachers and mentors of my beloved alma mater. I would like to extend my deepest gratitude for tireless efforts, patience, and dedication of our teachers, ably led by the school administration and staff that ensured the conducive and supportive environment for effective learning to happen, thus bringing you all here today. I would like to give the highest praise to our Almighty God as we are blessed and privileged to be witnessing this event today. To our dear graduates and their proud parents, congratulations! This graduation is indeed remarkable as we are able to celebrate it despite the pandemic we are facing, because this momentous event is worth celebrating. You have been through a lot to reach this milestone, and this is a big step towards the definition of how you would want to be remembered. I would like to call this batch COVID graduates. As you pursue on your journey, I would like to impart 5 important principles that help me endure and equip me through my own journey, which I hope will help you too. These principles stand in the acronym of COVID. C stands for consistency. Consistency is similar to the word persistency. I firmly believe that if you want something, you must always set your heart and mind on it. You must be consistent in achieving the goal, and if it's really for you, you can always have it. For me, consistency is one word for never give up. I grew up having my parents not always around me. My mother and my father were separated. My mother was an OFW and my father resided in Manila, while I was taken care of by my aunt here in Pangasinan. During my elementary days, my father promised to visit me every recognition day if I would go up on stage and manage to be one of the achievers. This is the reason why I set myself to be an honor student every year, or to the least, a ribbon awardee. True enough, because of my consistency to study, my father hadn't missed a single recognition day, and I graduated in elementary as second honorable mention. To meet my father every end of the school year was my motivation to consistently study. I set my goal higher in high school, and that is to be first in class, because I want to make my parents proud. Again, having this goal in mind led to consistent studying. As a result, I was able to be with my mother and father during my high school graduation, making them the proudest parent in the crowd, sitting at the valedictory table. Second, O. O stands for outsource. Outsource help and knowledge. We must not hesitate to seek help if needed. Be humble and do not think highly of yourself. Never think you know everything. Thus, you may always outsource knowledge if you think it will be significant for your growth, be it from new experience, environment, people, or education. Learning is a continuous process. Above all, outsource or seek help from our Heavenly Father. If you think you have given your all, you have been consistent, you have done everything you can, and yet you did not get the result you wanted, seek Him. God always knows what is best for us. Do not rely on your own strength. We must learn to trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not unto thine own understanding. V for the COVID stands for values. Values matter. Through our journey in life, we can be defined not by knowledge alone, but also by our values. We become successful not only through what we know, but also by good values instilled within us. I salute parents and teachers of our dear graduates because they are the pillar of today's graduates' character and good values. I stands for integrity. Integrity is an integral part of success. Always speak with honesty, think with sincerity, and act with integrity. When you are able to maintain your own highest standards of integrity, regardless of what others may do, you are destined for greatness. And lastly, D, to complete the acronym of COVID, stands for different timeline and different definition of success. We shall define our own timeline and success. Last year and up to now, most of my friends and batchmates got married. Some had and some are having their new babies, and I was genuinely happy for them. I realized most of them married and started their own family at society's defined ideal age of 27 to 30 after they build their career. In my case, it did not go that way. I have my own different timeline. As early as 20 years old, I gave birth to my eldest child and started a family at a very young age. Yes, we are a young parents. And I do not encourage everyone to do the same because it was indeed difficult. We started with almost nothing. What we clearly have that time were these two things. First, faith in the Lord that we can overcome this. And second, the quality education my husband and I have that our parents imparted us. We maximize and utilize this education to make a living. Step by step, my husband and I grew. And now, at the age of 29, we already have 3 kids. And God's mercy, we were able to start small businesses, purchase our own cars, bought a decent size of residential lot, and started building our dream house, designed and to be built by our own small construction firm, managed by my husband, architect Jaime Estelas Jr., who was, by the way, also an alumnus of MNHS, my batchmate from lower section, yet makes a living much more than my earnings. Despite having kids at an early age, I was still given the opportunity to pursue my passion to travel around the Philippines, as well my passion to study law. But these things do not define our true success. Because for us, raising 3 adorable children, having a family, a happy, self-reliant, and a Christ-centered family defined our true success. So, you see, graduates, we can have different timelines and be successful on our own definition. You can hear different stories, but amidst these differences, the most common denominator of these success stories is the quality education each have. Our theme for this year's graduation rites, Sulong Idakuladad, Championing the Nation's Future, a rallying call for quality basic education. This year, themes highlight the essential role of quality education in helping Filipino learners achieve their full potential in order to fulfill their dreams and contribute meaningfully to nation building. And I, myself, was a living testimony of how quality education helped us realize our dream. We may not have much, but we have something to start with, and that is our quality education. Let us extend our appreciation to our teachers and to the DepEd administrators as they pursue to give us this quality education, and invite all of us to support them as they strive to improve and keep up with this innovative time. Dear youth, remark yourself as COVID graduates and have what it takes to contribute meaningfully to nation building by creating your own success stories. Remember to be consistent. Don't hesitate to outsource help. Keep in mind that your good values will matter. Keep your integrity intact with you at all times. And don't let anyone or the society dictate your timeline and kind of success. Life is not a race. Don't compare yourself, neither compete with others. The only competition you should have is a competition against yourself. Strive to become better every day. If you are better today than yesterday, and you desire to be better tomorrow than today, then you are on the right track. Keep going. Mabuhay, graduates of 2020.
To Dr. Nicanor L. Langit, our Public Schools District Supervisor, I have the honor to present to you the 479 strong candidates for graduation, of which 217 male and 262 female, and with the strong recommendation of their advisors that they have satisfactorily completed and complied the minimum requirements prescribed by the Department of Education under the K-12 curriculum. These candidates are now ready for your confirmation.
By the authority of the school's Division Superintendent, Dr. Sheila Marie A. Promesias, and acting upon the recommendation of your principal, Madam Elvira O. Velasquez, that you have successfully completed all the requirements as prescribed by the Department of Education for senior high schools. I, Dr. Nicanor L. Langit, Public Schools District Supervisor, hereby confirm your graduation rights and declare your graduates of the Mapandan National High School effective today. I therefore confer upon you all the rights and privileges thereto appertaining. Congratulations!
Presenting the Mapandan Senior High School Class of 2020. The Accountancy Business and Management at 12A under advisor of Madam Lorna L. Flores. The Academic Excellence Awardees, Alarcio Shaina L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Attornino A. Alarcio, with honors, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Alcantara Precious Gem A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo M. Alcantara III, with honors, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Aquino Gemaline G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry F. Aquino, with honors, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Daroy Marian E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario P. Daroy, with honors, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, De Leon C.J. Rose P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Noel A. De Leon, with honors, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Ferrer John Randall M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rowley M. Ferrer, with honors, conduct awardee, Meneses Frali Zane M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus de Meneses, with honors, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Siron Angel Rose D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roma D. Siron, with honors, conduct awardee, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Zarate Grocery C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo A. Zarate, with honors, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Abracia II Rodolfo E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roderick A. Abracia, Gorin Jerzel A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy T. Gorin, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Hugo Romel L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo L. Hugo, Mangad Elmar F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Edmar L. Mangad, conduct awardee, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Matundan Jason Aldwin A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alan C. Matundan, Neri Christian Walter T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Watts S. Neri, Rojas Gori Mark O., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlo O. Rojas, Sokila Romar O., son of Mr. and Mrs. Charisse O. Sokila, Aquino Carmina E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro C. Aquino, Bautista Blas C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Jr. D. Bautista, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Bautista Geraldine S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio P. Bautista, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Castillo Ira M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy S. Castillo, Fernandez Roda D.G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert N. Fernandez, Gonzaga Angela V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Armando D. Gonzaga, Montoya Dijome A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald C. Montoya, Moyon Cariz I., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Modesto Jr. S. Moyon, Navarro Shaira O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo C. Navarro, Quinto Mary Gwyneth A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dexter S. Quinto, NC3 holder, bookkeeping, Revilla Alana O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Josepe P. Revilla, Serafica Angela Marie O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romel O. Serafica, Servito Gisette S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel L. Servito, Takike Melanie L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Exequiel C. Takike, Zapanta Caitlin Ann Z., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio V. Zapanta. Also, the Accountancy Business and Management 12B, under the advisor of Dr. Maria Vera C. Lalas. The Academic Excellence Awardees, Chan Joshua L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito L. Chan, with honors, NC3 holder, Dalupe Eman Ariel P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Emmanuel R. Dalupe, with honors, Best Research Presenter, NC3 holder, Guba Christopher C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Dandit D.C. Guba, with honors, Best Research Output, Jorge Mark Adrian A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel C. Jorge, with honors, Best Research Output, NC3 holder, Mondero Robert Matthew, son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Mondero, with honors, NC3 holder, Bautista Jeff Zia C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rosito T. Bautista, with honors, NC3 holder. De Guzman, Jambi C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Victoriano De Guzman Jr., with honors, Best Research Output, NC3 holder. Espinoza, Rinalyn S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo A. Espinoza, with honors, Best Research Output, NC3 holder. Mercado Betsy Marie H., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario M. Mercado, with honors, Best Research Presenter, NC3 holder. Morales Patricia D.C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eleuterio B. Morales, with honors, Best Research Presenter, NC3 holder. Pagigan Angeline D., daughter of Mrs. Angelita D. Pagigan, with honors, NC3 holder. Servito Renzi Ann F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Efren C. Servito, with honors, NC3 holder. Talinio Shikaina May G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romualdo A. Talinio, with honors, Best Research Presenter, NC3 holder. Daus Terry S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo L. Daus, Best Research Output. Quinto, John Ryan A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benito D.V. Quinto. Samson Mark Philip S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Philip D.V. Samson. Seva Cyril J. L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jared E. Seva. Soriano Richard E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Bonifacio Soriano. Tambawan David L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eugenio L. Tambawan, Best Research Output. Baniket Francie Revel R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo F. Baniket. Bautista Rhea Rose, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo Q. Ballesteros, Best Research Output. Claveria Rowan L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Conrado S. Claveria. De Los Reyes Mary Ann, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edelberto B. De Los Reyes. Guerrero Genevieve N. B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Raul P. Guerrero, Best Research Output. Jimenez Nariza Joy S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nazareno Jimenez, NC3 holder. Nato Erica, daughter of Miss Jenny P. Nato. Ramos Fermina O., daughter of Mrs. Elenita O. Ramos, Best Research Output, NC3 holder. Silvestre Daisy, daughter of Mrs. Maria Cristina G. Silvestre. Soriano Diana Lane P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alex Soriano Sr., Best Research Output. Sopnet Camille Joyce L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Camilo T. Sopnet Jr. Villacorta Missy S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Byron B. Villacorta, Best Research Output, NC3 holder. The General Academic Strand, under advisor of Ma'am Vilma A. Mara. The Academic Excellence Awardee, Lopez Michael Angelo S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Angelo P. Lopez, with honors, MIL Excellence Awardee, Abracia James Harold S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Abracia. Abrera Michael Q., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel F. Abrera, Conduct Awardee, MIL Excellence Awardee. Aquino Emmanuel P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arman N. Aquino. Busa Jasper L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Nonito L. Busa. Caspilio Rutherford P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo P. Caspilio. Sarah Jason Henry L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Oscar V. Serra. Conduct Awardee, Best in Immersion, MIL Excellence Awardee. The Twin Adrian Lawrence C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eddie the Twin, MIL Excellence Awardee. De Vera John Zymer R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joel A. De Vera, Conduct Awardee, MIL Excellence Awardee. Manangan Dixon P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Dick S. Aquino. Mapanaw Julius A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lilia P. Aquino. Muzada Mark Russell T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Muzada. Nisperos Mark T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Nisperos. Olandia Christian J. M., son of Mrs. Angeline N. Olandia. Padilla Aljan S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo M. Padilla. Pinulyar Erwin G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario R. Pinulyar. Petrola James Erwin B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Arsenio G. Petrola. Reyes Ian G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ismael D. P. Reyes. Soriano Romel O., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Soriano. Trinidad Jomar P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joel C. Trinidad. Imasa Grayson D.G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Sonny A. Imasa. Zabala Junjun C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Cesar V. Zabala. Agustin Angelica C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur M. Agustin. Agustin Jacqueline J.R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Agustin. Biala Mariel G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario P. Biala. David Arabella V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nido T. David. De Vera Angelica May F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin C. De Vera. Ferrer Hannah Nicole S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel N. Ferrer. Gum Hazel R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Gum Jr. Kaiser Chris May M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Loretta C. Kaiser. Manlongat Jingjing L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eugenio G. Manlongat. Mayugba Lovella Nika B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lovely Botoyong. Padua Kylan P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Orlando Padua. Paragas Jaquilu B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Andres Paragas. Paulino Hazel Ann A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Melba Paulino. Pinulyar KZR, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Pinulyar. Solivin Leia Ann C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leticia Solivin. Soriano Army Joy S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Soriano. Soto Stephanie, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Walter Martinez. Villota Krisha Ruby Ann A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Chrysostoma Villota. Visperas Jeneline V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rufino Visperas. Let's have the Humanities and Social Sciences 12A under the advisor of Ms. Ermeline P. Rivera. The Academic Excellence Awardees: Castro Clarence Dave B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Donnie E. Castro, with honors. Garcia Emily C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Zeldy M. Garcia, with honors. Gatinga Karen Jean A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cipriano V. Gatinga, with honors. Best Research Output. Lalas Alma L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Walter T. Lalas, with honors. Maglalang Rayalyn L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo O. Maglalang, with honors. Panoringan Nika Lyra R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Federico B. Panoringan, with honors. Leadership Award, Best Research Presenter. Sevilla Romelyn N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo S. Sevilla, with honors. Best Research Output. Ancheta Jr. Francisco V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Francisco N. Ancheta. Aquino Lawrence C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Leome P. Aquino. Badua Charles V. L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Victoria B. Badua. Bungato Gerald M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Gennaro M. Bungato. Best Research Output. Cabandig Mark Chester L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario F. Aquino. Caber Gian Carlos C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roy S. Caber, Best Research Output. Carpio Jr. Terso P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Terso M. Carpio, Conduct Awardee. Cleofe Janelle Robert S.A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Francisco B. Cleofe. De Guzman Lester J., son of Mr. and Mrs. Wesley D. De Guzman. Dizon William, son of Mrs. Cynthia B. Dizon. Francisco Jerome S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Teofilo T. Francisco Jr. Lalakit Mark Dominic S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo D.J. Lalakit. Langit Jov Lyndon C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ovito T. Langit. Pasana Moises P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo V. Pasana. Prado Ruel C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo S. Prado Jr. Kirimit Sammy Jr. C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Sammy A. Kirimit Sr., Best Research Output. Rancodo Jerwin R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reyes C. Rancodo. Sidraon John Paul B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo S. Siraon, Best Research Output. Soriano Ian G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo D. Soriano. Tianan Michael C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto C. Tianan. Valencia Marvin T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel B. Valencia. Aquino Adriana Marie N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald N. Garcia. Bungato Jasmine M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernie M. Bungato. Brunuela Monica M. J. M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Moises N. Brunuela. Carinio Mystica J., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime B. Carinio. Sindania Jenny D. V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nestor E. Sindania. Coroneza Jambi V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel D. Coroneza. De Guzman Michelle Rose A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ruben M. De Guzman. Ihapon Juvie N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joy A. Ihapon. Langit Nicole Angela C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michael G. Langit, conduct awardee. Luquiao Deza May, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gina P. Luquiao. Lumibao Corina Lauren L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jeremias L. Lumibao, Best Research Output. Madayan Jasmine A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juan F. Madayan, Best Research Output. Mangsat Kimberly B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert G. Mangsat. Paragas Joanne P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro A. Mejia Jr. Pinuliar Kyle Ashley G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Euphrasia Jr. G. Pinuliar, conduct awardee. Pirado Cyrene S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nelson L. Pirado. Sukila Zaiza Frist, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Salvacion O. Sukila. Soto Angeline S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio E. Soto. Urbano Christine Joy A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo N. Urbano, conduct awardee. Villanueva Rose S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Boy J. Torrio, Best Research Output. Next, the Humanities and Social Sciences 12B, under the advisor of Ms. Maricris A. de Guzman. The Academic Excellence Awardees: Caliuliu TJT, son of Mr. and Mrs. Federico M. Caliuliu, with honors, Best Research Presenter. Alindayo Filipina P., daughter of Mrs. Annalisa C. Palma, with honors, Conduct Awardee. De Guzman Riza May N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Samuel B. de Guzman, with honors, Fernandez Jelly Ann S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benji M. Fernandez, with honors, Parajas Diane Rosel C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo R. Parajas, with honors, Bezen Research Output. Simbrano Myla Jane V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Julius N. Simbrano, with honors. Tabolong Christine Z., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roger A. Tabolong, with honors, Conduct Awardee. Best Actress or Duo Film Festival 2019, Ubando Christine Joy C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juan C. Ubando Jr., with honors, Best Research Presenter, Best and Research Output, Conduct Awardee. Alfante Clint A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benji Alfante. Aquino Marlu M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo C. Aquino. Batin Carlos Jan C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Cesario R. Batin. Brillante Romel L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jeronimo M. Brillante, Conduct Awardee. Calderon Samdi Mark D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador S. Calderon, Conduct Awardee. Calizo Marvin B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Armando A. Calizo, Conduct Awardee. Casta Darrell M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo D. Casta, Conduct Awardee. Ferialde Nixon Ken E., son of Mrs. Elisa E. Ferialde, Lead Actor Excellence Award, Athlete of the Year. Langit Mark R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Michelle H. Langit. Macedonio John R.J. G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry O. Macedonio, Best and Research Output. Manawis Jared Chan Q, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Manawis Jr. Pinulyar Edwin Jr. M, son of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Pinulyar Sr., best and research output. Rodriguez John Daniel C, son of Mr. and Mrs. Bernabe Rodriguez, best and research output. Turalba Jr. Romeo, son of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Dulfo Sr., best and research output. Velasquez Romel M, son of Mr. and Mrs. Roland C. Velasquez, best in research output. Villamil John Paul R, son of Mr. and Mrs. Elpidio T. Villamil. Alejandro Melissa M, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rusty Alejandro Sr. Bautista Joanna Camille A, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Bautista. Ilinzano Norlin S, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Ilinzano Jr., best and research output. Lalakit Jessamay O, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon A. Lalakit, best and research output. Lalata Eliza Jane A, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Lalata Jr. Lopez Sharvie Jane A, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Victoriano P. Lopez. Loyola LMA S, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Delphine M. Loyola. Morales Mylene M, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Loreto T. Morales. Pandan Hazel Ann D.V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edgardo M. Pandan. Peralta Mary Joy T, daughter of Mrs. Viniranda T. Peralta. Serapion Clara B, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Camilo A. Serapion. Servito Mary Rose O, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dante P. Servito. Soldao Mary Angel M, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfo S. Soldao, best and research output. Surabin Jackie Roseanne B, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rafael S. Surabin. Tabuyan Rosa Camille L, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo F. Tabuyan. Tolentino Jana Denise M, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey M. Tolentino, best and research output. Velasco Giselle T, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Velasco Jr. The Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics 12, under the advisor of Sir Felipe Sotelo Jr. The Academic Excellence Awards. Julian Jericho D.G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Avelino R. Julian Jr., with high honors. Award for Outstanding Research Presentation. Award for Outstanding Performance in Mathematics. Conduct Awardee. Viola Bea Angelique M, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernard A. Viola Jr., with high honors. Award for Outstanding Performance in Science. Conduct Awardee. Abrigo Ronaldin D, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Abrigo Jr., with honors. Conduct Awardee. Viola Eliza Marie P, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Adolfo D. Viola, with honors. Conduct Awardee. Cercado Catherine Ann P, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo R. Cercado, with honors. Conduct Awardee. Lalangan Giselle T, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joel O. Lalangan, with honors. Conduct Awardee. Lalas Love Divine D, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonard V. Lalas, with honors. Conduct Awardee. Cerame Clarice B, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cesar G. Cerame, with honors. Award for Outstanding Performance in Communication Arts. Conduct Awardee. Fernandez Charlene May L, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Randy R. Fernandez, with honors. Award for Outstanding Performance in Communication Arts. Conduct Awardee. Soriano Manny James F, son of Mr. and Mrs. Manny A. Soriano, with honors. Award for Outstanding Performance in Mathematics. Award for Outstanding Performance in Athletics, Chess. Conduct Awardee. Honorado Margie B, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo S. Honorado, with honors. Conduct Awardee. Rodriguez Dennis M, son of Mr. and Mrs. Nestor B. Rodriguez, with honors. Award for Outstanding Performance in Mathematics. Conduct Awardee. Jiang Xinyu A, daughter of Miss Nieves Emma Piloda, with honors. Conduct Awardee. Lubrin Azesa Jane F, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Erde G. Lubrin, with honors. Conduct Awardee. Revilla Jefferson Yu, son of Mr. and Mrs. Fernando L. Revilla, with honors conduct awardee. Pahinag Donald Miguel P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynald L. Pahinag, with honors conduct awardee. Abracia Mark Daniel E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo C. Abracia, special recognition in athletics. Aquino Beljan G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mamerto N. Aquino. Arcangel Carlo F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Emilio F. Arcangel. Bambalan John Francis D.G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roland R. Bambalan. Viador Michael Larry S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Larry G. Viador. Cubanlig Mark Kevin A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ignacio F. Cubanlig Jr., award for outstanding performance in arts, special recognition in athletics. Carino Nico D.V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose G. Carino. David Menandro Jr. L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Menandro F. David, special recognition in athletics. Raskin Mark Stephen A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo C. Raskin. Gonzalez James Harrison P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert Q. Gonzalez. Jodup Lawrence Jr. G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence U. Jodup. Lalas Kevin Ray A., son of Mrs. Belinda A. Lalas. Mamayson Joseph Kerubin C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Bobby G. Mamayson. Serafika Jose Manuel A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jose B. Serafika. Sokila Roderick M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romel V. Sokila. Soriano Mark Daniel F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Melcher F. Soriano, special recognition in athletics. Tandingan Lian Joshua D.J., son of Mr. and Mrs. Angelo A. Tandingan, special recognition in athletics. Visperas Al Gendrix T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alan L. Visperas, special recognition in athletics. Visperas Christopher Emmanuel J., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus M. Visperas, award for outstanding research presentation. Zacharias John Mark B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marley J. Zacharias, special recognition in athletics. Aquino L.J.A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry T. Aquino. Benitez Daphne Rose T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Richard V. Benitez. Lalas Ruth O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Contrada Z. Lalas. Magalong Geraldine C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eulogio B. Magalong. Ogbinar John Ira Rose S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roja D. Ogbinar. Pinuliar Cresca Joy B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Armando Z. Pinuliar. The Caregiving 12A, under the advisor of Romaila B. Jimenez, B. Academic Excellence Awardees. De La Cruz Christine Joy E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arturo De La Cruz, with honors caregiving and title holder. Pinuliar Sherry May V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Pinuliar, with honors caregiving and title holder. Ramirez Catherine D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Ramirez, with honors caregiving and title holder. Santos Jubilee N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo Santos, with honors caregiving and title holder. Tibrio Monica A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Tibrio, with honors caregiving and title holder. Hilot Wellness Massage and title holder. Hilot Wellness Massage and title Excellence Awardee. Visperas Julian Faye S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Visperas, with honors caregiving and title holder. Best Research Presenter, caregiving and title Excellence Awardee. Biagtan Kevin Angelo A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Percival Biagtan, caregiving and title holder. Hilo Wellness Massage and title holder. Bulaki Angelo M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Carlito Bulaki, caregiving and title holder. Quizon Lester DC, son of Mr. and Mrs. Nestor Quizon, caregiving and title holder. Hilo Wellness Massage and title holder. Di Guzman Rovic C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodel Di Guzman, caregiving and title holder. Soriano Noel B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Perfecto Soriano, caregiving and title holder. Hilo Wellness Massage and title holder. Hilo Wellness Massage and title Excellence Awardee. Villa Cruz's Jake F., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey Suratos, caregiving NC2 holder, caregiving NC2 excellence worthy, conduct awardee, Villamin Jefferson S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Villamin, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Villanueva Jake D.G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Villanueva, caregiving NC2 holder, Abainza Erica Marie V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eric Abainza, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Andrada Gia Joy M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Oliver Andrada, caregiving NC2 holder, Arcangel Ferry Ann C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Federico Arcangel, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Biala Crizel G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Biala, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Bilyote Camila P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eugenia Bilyote, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Carinio Mary Hart V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricky Carinio, Cerezo Christine M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Cerezo, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, De Los Reyes Maybelline M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon De Los Reyes, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Dumayas Jessica L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cristina Dumayas, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Galigues Abigail E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edgardo Galigues, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, caregiving NC2 excellence awardee, Garcia Camila G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cesario Garcia, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Gatinga Jelly L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lito Gatinga, Guapa Karen B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cosmic Guapa, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Gutuman Lian Nicole V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Gutuman Jr., caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Jose Rachel May C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Randy Balsita, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Lopez Michelle B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rustico Lopez, caregiving NC2 holder, conduct awardee, Lopez Shane Apple P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mar Lopez, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Waing Kimberly C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Iner Waing, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Pinulyar Kayla May S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jairine Pinulyar, housekeeping NC2 holder, Pinulyar Kristen V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Orlando Pinulyar, caregiving NC2 holder, Ramos J. Anfe O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Felipe Ramos, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Retuya Crystal Joy E., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo Retuya, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Sirain Lori Jane M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Loreto Sirain, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Servito Rica D.G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jacinto Servito, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Viloria Renalyn C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rico Viloria, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Visperas Anna Rose M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Visperas, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Visperas Marie Ann Q., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Visperas, caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Visperas Marjorie C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Visperas, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder, Visperas Mylan C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Visperas, caregiving NC2 holder, housekeeping NC2 holder. The caregiving 12B under advisor of Ms. Hazel F. Gacusana, The Academic Excellence Awardees: Bautista John Leila Maris V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marvin Bautista, with honors conduct awardee, Best in Caregiving NC2, Best in Work Immersion, Best in Research Output, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Maningding Rochelle T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mandy Maningding Sr., with honors conduct awardee, Best in Caregiving NC2, Best in Work Immersion, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 Excellence Awardee, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Castro Jimboy H., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jesse Castro, Best in Research Output, David Angelo R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro David. De Guzman Joshua P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime De Guzman, Best in Research Output. De Guzman Reggie P., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jared De Guzman, Caregiving NC2 holder. Dinora J. Rose B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Junardin Cerame. Fernandez Jojo R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Fernandez, Best in Work Immersion. Mahipos Justin Cholo C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Tomas Villanueva, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Manawis Alan Bert A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alberto Manawis. Nabua Joshua I., son of Mr. and Mrs. Teofilo Nabua, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Nanyaska Ezekiel V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joey Nanyaska, Best in Research Output. Silvestre Emmanuel M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Constantino Silvestre, Caregiving NC2 holder, Best in Research Output. Soriano Junicio Jr. B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Junicio Soriano Sr. Visperas Terwin A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Visperas, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Arsaga Arlene M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ariel Arsaga. Ballesteros Jessica A., daughter of Miss Elvira Ballesteros, Caregiving NC2 holder, Housekeeping NC2 holder. Bungato Riza U., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jennifer Bungato, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilot Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Busante Dayan Grace B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Conrado Busante, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Best in Research Output. Brukil Christine Faye A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Fernando Brukil. Caldito Rosan M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Caldito, conduct awardee, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Cardenio Jacqueline C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Junior Cardenio, conduct awardee, Caregiving NC2 holder. Casilang Athena May N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Casilang, Caregiving NC2 holder. De Guzman Hartlin R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie De Guzman. De Guzman Lovely H., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito De Guzman. Edgar Kimberly S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Edgar, Best in Research Output. Fernandez Edeline G. May DG, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Edith Fernandez, conduct awardee, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Infante Jonna Faye M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mark Infante, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Best in Research Output. Laitan Muriel M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George Laitan, Caregiving NC2 holder, Housekeeping NC2 holder. Mejia Menchi M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dante Mejia, Caregiving NC2 holder. Mendoza Rachel B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Mendoza, Housekeeping NC2 holder. Morales Donalyn C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Donato Morales, Caregiving NC2 holder, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Best in Research Output. Morales Joanne O., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juan Morales, conduct awardee, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder. Oraa Shaina May M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gilear Oraa, Caregiving NC2 holder, Housekeeping NC2 holder. Petrola Irma R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ermi Petrola, Caregiving NC2 holder, Housekeeping NC2 holder. Hindin Vanessa G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bertito Ragindin, Best in Research Output, Ramos Annalisa A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Ramos, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Rondolos Patricia T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Montesa, Caregiving NC2 holder, Salinas Micaela S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernadette Tibayan, Salon Gina M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George Salon, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Season Diana L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Darwin Season, Caregiving NC2 holder, Maria Mary Joy S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Soria, Caregiving NC2 holder, Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Soriano Jonalyn Yu, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Soriano, Caregiving NC2 holder, Soriano Kimberly Therese M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Soriano, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Soriano Mary Grace I., daughter of Miss Merlita Soriano, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Sorait Ella S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Federico Sorait, Caregiving NC2 holder, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Soribin Arlene D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Renato Soribin, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Tapiceria Jennifer M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lorenzo Tapiceria Jr., Hilo Wellness Massage NC2 holder, Ongria Quizame S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cristino Ongria, Caregiving NC2 holder, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Best in Research Output, Saldivar Patricia M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Salvador, Housekeeping NC2 holder, Best in Research Output. The Cookery 12A, under the advisor of Ms. Glyza Marie M. Sindonia. The Academic Excellence Awardee, Soriano Karen P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lito T. Soriano Jr., Best in Work Immersion, Conduct Awardee, FBS NC2 holder. Kabutahe Anthony R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio M. Kabutahe, FBS NC2 holder. Di Guzman Jonel C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Teresa E. Di Guzman. Dulay Jonel T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Godofredo R. Dulay. Ferrer Luigi C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Louis F. Ferrer, Conduct Awardee, FBS NC2 holder. Luis Giancarlo DJ, son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonia C. Luis, FBS NC2 holder. Madayag Mark Francis R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Fernando F. Madayag, FBS NC2 holder. Narito Rumar E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo C. Narito. Perez John Jefferson C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Remio P. Perez, Conduct Awardee, Best in FBS, FBS NC2 holder. Petrola Raven C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin V. Corla, FBS NC2 holder. Samson Neil Angelo E., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jill P. Samson, Shapnon J. Mariu, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy D. Shapno. Samio Ariel B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Nestor R. Samio, FBS NC2 holder. Taming Chandray C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie S. Taming, FBS NC2 holder. Benluan Adrian D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto F. Benluan, FBS NC2 holder. Agustin Kyla A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Gio Q. Agustin, FBS NC2 holder. Biandilia Therese May C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo C. Biandilia, FBS NC2 holder. Dulay Justin P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Conrado I. Dulay, Conduct Awardee, FBS NC2 holder. Ferrer Ira F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo C. Ferrer, FBS NC2 holder. Gatinga Cindy Joy C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Fabiano V. Gatinga, FBS NC2 holder. Imos Rochelle V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando A. Imos, FBS NC2 holder. Infante Pamela Rose S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Armin V. Infante, FBS NC2 holder. La Chica Rebecca V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy V. La Chica, Best in Bread and Pastry Production, FBS NC2 holder. Langit Rodelyn K. GC, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolph P. Langit, FBS, and title holder. Liana May B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ronald C. Liana. Lopez Giselle M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Jonas D. Lopez, FBS, and title holder. Nastor Jasmine Q., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime E. Nastor, FBS, and title holder. Prado Camila Q., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Claudio E. Prado, FBS, and title holder. Soriano Rica Angela L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo P. Soriano, FBS, and title holder. The Cookery 12B, under advisor of Madam Amalia C. Tibayan. The Academic Excellence Awardees. Bergilius Jason Jr. B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jason Bergilius Sr., with honors conduct awardee. Calzona Christine B., daughter of Mr. Phil Calzona, with honors conduct awardee. De la Cuadra Katrina N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Terso De la Cuadra, with honors conduct awardee. Guba Zara May G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romel Guba, with honors conduct awardee. Morales Monica B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pilario Morales, with honors conduct awardee. Narcisa Haname I., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Harold Narcisa, with honors conduct awardee. Bautista Maljan D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Bautista. Quizon John Mark M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Alan Quizon. Embuiro John Russell A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Edelberto Embuiro, conduct awardee. Eden MacDonald Iria, son of Mr. and Mrs. George Eden. Ferrer Mark Anthony M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Gerardo Ferrer. Limbaga Joshua Ray B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Limbaga. Macalanda Daniel Cedric, son of Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Ramos, best in immersion. Petrola Daniel C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Petrola. Soriano Robert Z., son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Soriano. Tives Steven Nicolas S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Septemo Tives. Zarate Dennis A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Zarcelio Zarate. Aquino Krisha May C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Aquino. Cabreros Jolina R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Epe Cabreros, conduct awardee. De Guzman Janica Ann G., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jing De Guzman. Garcia Felicity A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romo Garcia. Ibanez Sheila S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Ibanez. Paigani Angela Princess L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Paigani, conduct awardee. Permison Joy C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Permison. Racaza Evelyn Q., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Racaza, conduct awardee. Villafania Julina Joy P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. George Villafania. The Computer System Servicing 12A, under advisor of Sir Manu Lorman F. Paraino. The Academic Excellence Awardees. Coloma Kevin B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Edward Coloma Sr., with honors best in programming, conduct awardee. Elito Christian N., son of Mr. and Mrs. Jess Francis Elito, with honors best in computer system servicing skill NC2 holder, best in immersion, conduct awardee. Villanueva Angelo R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Villanueva, with honors best in computer system servicing skill NC2 holder, best in programming, conduct awardee. Juquino Rowena Vic C., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Victor Juquino, with honors best in programming, best in immersion, conduct awardee. Abarcar Ranson N., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto C. Abarcar. Abiliera Mark Lester S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador C. Abiliera. Abrigo Philip G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Leopoldo V. Abrigo. Agustin Lester Quint S., son of Mrs. Nida M. Soto. Angeles Jobert M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rafael Angeles. Antero Louis Anthony A., son of Mrs. Estelito Abad. Aquino Kian Vincent M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Andres Aquino, conduct awardee. Bautista Melvin, son of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel B. Bautista, conduct awardee. Dakanay Michael Dave C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador Dakanay, Best in Computer System Servicing Skill NC2 holder, Best in Programming, Best in Immersion, conduct awardee. De Guzman John Denver V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio De Guzman. De La Cruz Marlon V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Robelio P. De La Cruz. Diego Mel Vincent C., son of Mrs. Melissa Cabiniela. Diones Paulo M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Noel Diones. Feliciano Nicolas G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Nicasio Pascua, Best in Immersion, conduct awardee. Ferrer Zyrene, son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynante Ferrer. Garcia Colleen A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Armenio Garcia. Guzman John Ashley A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Guzman, conduct awardee. Mendoza JPA, son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Mendoza, Best in Computer System Servicing Skill NC2 holder, Best in Programming, Best in Immersion, conduct awardee. Musada Julian Patrick S., son of Mrs. Edita Soriano. Nato Junicio S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Junicio Nato Jr., conduct awardee. Ovido Leonald M., son of Mrs. Narcisa Muriano. Paulino Mark Lester D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Paulino, conduct awardee. Perez Andrew S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Roderick Perez, conduct awardee. Rahman Abdul Rakib A., son of Mrs. Evelyn Aquino. Revilla Jason Yu, son of Mr. and Mrs. Fernando Revilla, Best in Programming, Best in Immersion, conduct awardee. Retuya Robert Jr. G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Retuya. Salva Darwin V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Salva. Sirain Bernie Jr. DG., son of Mr. and Mrs. Bernie T. Sirain, Best in Computer System Servicing Skill NC2 holder, Best in Programming, Best in Immersion, conduct awardee. Solver Christopher S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lagerta Junjun Solver, Best in Computer System Servicing Skill NC2 holder, conduct awardee. Visperas Mark Ben D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Benji Visperas. Angeles Shane Yu, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime Angeles Sr., conduct awardee. Badua Andrea Lynn R., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alejandre Badua, conduct awardee. Biacan Claudine A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Diosdado L. Biacan. Bulatao Charmaine A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Bulatao, conduct awardee. Cabico Lovely P., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo F. Cabico, conduct awardee. Sindania Raisa S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Florentino Sindania, Best in Computer System Servicing Skill NC2 holder, conduct awardee. Camilette Cecil D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Benigno M. Camilo Gomolizel, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Magalong, conduct awardee. Hikaw Myla T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eller Hikaw. Hipolito Joanna Marie T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Noli Hipolito, conduct awardee. Langit Joanne M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Saturnino Balakidan. Morales Trisha May Z., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Elmer Morales. Nepomuceno Melody L., daughter of Mrs. Daisy Nepomuceno, conduct awardee. The Computer System Servicing 12B, under the advisor of Ms. Athea May U. Calaunan. The Academic Excellence Awardees: Cabico Jerwin M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto A. Cabico, with honors. NC2 passer, Best in Programming. MIL Excellence Awardee, Conduct Awardee. De Guzman Sherilyn D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo P. De Guzman, with honors. MIL Excellence Awardee, Conduct Awardee. Marquez Joanna Lee S., daughter of Mr. Jomaray T. Marquez, with honors. NC2 passer, Best Research Presenter. MIL Excellence Awardee, Best in Programming, Conduct Awardee. Reyes Kenneth T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo T. Reyes Jr., with honors. NC2 passer, MIL Excellence Awardee, Conduct Awardee. Villanueva Kenneth D.G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Lucada P. Villanueva, with honors. MIL Excellence Awardee, Conduct Awardee. Anakta Joshua B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Junicio Anacta, and Situpazar Conza Kawardi. Viador Francisco Jr. L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Sr. Viador. Biala Mark Leo G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Biala, and Situpazar, best in immersion, Kanda Kawardi. Kalimbas Giancarlo A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Johnny B. Kalimbas, and Situpazar, best in immersion, best in programming, Kanda Kawardi. Carinio Justin Mark G., son of Mr. and Mrs. Victor C. Carinio. Condesa Marlon R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Iglesia Condesa. De la Cruz Aaron Jacob J., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo C. De la Cruz. Espino Noriel M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario M. Espino. Espirito Edison D.C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo R. Espirito. Fuertes Clarence, son of Miss Jocelyn Fuertes. Gatinga Jose Enrique T., son of Mr. and Mrs. Gerardo C. Gatinga. Gutuman Lester M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Luis A. Gutuman. Manawis Harold D., son of Mr. and Mrs. Herminia Manawis. Manuel Jonald V., son of Mr. and Mrs. Idolo S. Manuel. Morales Jomer C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador V. Morales. Natnat John Lester C., son of Mr. and Mrs. Felipe Natnat. Navarro Mark Wendell L., son of Mr. and Mrs. Romeo S. Navarro. Nuki Borneo Ashley G., son of Miss Arlen B. Garin. And Situpazar, best in immersion, best in programming, Kanta Kawardi. Pinuliar Raymond S., son of Mr. and Mrs. Pablo Pinuliar Jr. Pitonio Emiliano Jr. M., son of Mr. and Mrs. Emiliano Pitonio Sr. Sagon Mark John R., son of Mr. and Mrs. Marlito G. Sagon. Tropia J. Mark B., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joey R. Tropia, MIL Excellence Awardi. Vesperas Jonathan C., son of Mr. and Mrs. John C. Vesperas. Abracia Catherine Bay D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Berne B. Abracia, Kanta Kawardi. Albania Monica T., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Albania Sr. Bautista Maricar M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Carlos G. Bautista, Kanta Kawardi. Carinio Jacel Zaira D., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus R. Carinio, best in immersion. Castillo Princess A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Nestor S. Castillo. De Guzman Maria Veronica S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jessie S. De Guzman. Sarah Catherine S., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfie Sarah. Garcia Jennifer N., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime U. Garcia, Kanta Kawardi. Macarling Hanamay F., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo A. Macarling. Mejia Jean V., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel E. Mejia. Roses April Jane M., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy S. Roses. Rodriguez Zaren Joy A., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jesus C. Rodriguez, Kanta Kawardi. Suratos Delin B., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ricky B. Suratos. Zapanta Jennifer L., daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Zapanta Jr. At this juncture, let's hear the words of gratitude from STEM 12 with high honors, Mr. Jericho Julian.
Good day, everyone. No words can express how thankful I am and honored for this opportunity that is given to me to share my sincere appreciation and gratitude to all of you. But first, I would like to congratulate my fellow graduates and all the supportive parents. Ladies and gentlemen, every end has a new beginning. Our senior high school life is about to end, but the new lessons to be cherished is about to start. We are about to leave our alma mater, but we should never forget to put this institution in our hearts. We've been through a lot of challenges. We've been through happiness, and behind that happiness are tears and struggles tried to put us down. But this day, I can say we are all victorious for surpassing all the challenges we have faced throughout our senior high school. I am always grateful to our God Almighty for being my real-life advisor. He says in Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a good future." And this verse reminds me of to be strong always. To my family, who gives their full support and unending love, I want to say thank you for keeping me motivated. To our teachers, advisors, and the whole faculty and staff of Mapandan National High School, Ma'am, Sir, thank you for teaching and molding us to be a better person. To the parents, STEM family, classmates, and friends, it is my pleasure to give you my sincere appreciation for being there as my guide during this journey. Anxiety was the first thing I felt during my first day in senior high school. Well, perhaps it was all about the adjustments like having new teachers, classmates, and the like. But as the days went by, I have gained new friends and trustworthy mentors. I also realized that my life as a student is a racing game. My eyes symbolize me as an ordinary student. Every part of my body are my loved ones, friends, those who believe in me, and the finish line as my prize and the target goal. But it's not easy for me to take the journey where I am now. In every path we take, there are always rocks and walls which represent negativities and criticisms. Those walls and rocks tried to keep my eyes closed, like I was losing hope, but I tried to focus and take the prize. Also, my body kept saying to me that I should move forward, thanks to those people around me. A friend of mine told me to always be humble and be thankful even to those people who are part of my Goliath, because they have made me stronger enough to fight for another battle. Amidst the crisis we are facing right now, my fellow graduates, I just want to say, chin up! Keep fighting, keep working hard, and always remember to be grateful to life. It is not bad to dream big, but never be stuck in dreaming. You must wake up in order to fulfill and transform those dreams into reality. Fellow graduates, as we leave one of our training grounds, let us use the life-changing events and memories we have learned as our swords and shining armors to fight against real-life battles. I, Jericho de Guzman Julian, STEM student, giving you my support and a big thank you. Keep flying and soaring high. Again, to my fellow graduates, congratulations and God bless you. To God be all the glory.
Pledge of the Graduates. We, the graduates of Mapandan National High School, do hereby solemnly declare that we will remain loyal to my alma mater. We will exhibit the core values advocated by our school and the Department of Education: makadiyos, makabayan, makatao, at makabansa. We pledge to our best that whatever we do and wherever we go, we shall faithfully uphold the best of our abilities and the ideals for which the Mapandan National High School stands: loyalty, cooperation, good fellowship, and good citizenship. Utilize my education in serving my family, the country, and God.
I close my eyes and I can see the world is waiting up for me, that I call my own. Through the dark, through a mountain before, but I
I think about the world could be a vision of all I see. A really dream is all it's gonna take. A million dreams for the world we're gonna make. There's a house we can build, every room inside is filled with the things from far away. The special things like comfort, each of wonder make you smile on a rainy day. They can say